If we experience the world as an extension of ourselves.
And mass extinctions, I mean.
Until he left that position where he was standing, he couldn't see what was invisible from there. He had to actually go somewhere else for things to come into view.
I'm Arnold Schroder.
I'm Tanner Millen.
And this is a podcast that does not yet have a name, but will by the time you are hearing it. And we're here to talk about, why don't you take a crack at defining what it is we're doing first?
I think that's multifaceted, but the main thing that I'm interested in is how we change someone's political psychology or relationship to like eco-psychology, I guess is a term that we could phrase it as. And the way we plan to do that is to have wide-ranging conversations with people based on things that have happened in their life, their personal transformation, people we know who have either gone from a libertarian or right-wing perspective to a more I don't want to say conscious viewpoint, but like a more egalitarian viewpoint. Or I'm honestly even interested if someone talking to people who came from more like liberal backgrounds or like wealthy neoliberal backgrounds, not necessarily like hardcore right wing, and if how they transitioned to a more ecological and egalitarian mindset.
Yeah, I think that the way that I've been tending to talk about it with people, I notice I consistently start by saying something to the effect that the only thing of any real interest that remains to be said about the ecological crisis is people are massively variable in their capacity to respond to it. It is no longer interesting to release scientific consensus statements that say, hey, the problem isn't just really bad, it's really, really, really bad, or, whatever. Like, it's not just going to be an intergenerational catastrophe, it's going to be a massive intergenerational catastrophe. And that, there's just kind of nothing in terms of the explicit argumentation about what is happening that feels really relevant to relitigate. And this gets into this whole reality that, starting, I think Lakoff and Johnson released their philosophy in the flesh about embodied cognition and the fact that there really is no such thing as disembodied abstract thought almost 25 years ago now. But we still talk in so many realms of politics and even science. Like, I would say scientific communication about the ecological crisis is still very heavily burdened by these kind of Enlightenment notions of, the undifferentiated disembodied rationality of humanity. And, really stuck in the argument itself, in the rational discourse itself, rather than the question of why different people in different embodied states of being are or are not receptive to these various forms of rationality in which these like threat messages are being conveyed. And so I don't think that there is any one state that we can ultimately refer to, any one temperament from which awareness of this stuff comes from. But I think ultimately we're kind of trying to figure out, how do people become capable of psychologically integrating the fact that the world is dying and that the political system we currently inhabit is totally incapable of doing anything but hastening that death. And this ranges everywhere from people such as myself who just kind of had a transformative experience in the forest when they were teenagers. We can really get into that sort of poverty of the stimulus thing in learning theory where it didn't take much information for me to come to a very rich set of conclusions. And then somewhere on another, point in the matrix or end of the spectrum or whatever, there's people who can be repeatedly barraged with unequivocal evidence of imminent catastrophe, and they're just not responsive. And yeah, so I mean, I think that this is the paths to the kind of responsiveness and awareness that we're looking for are probably myriad, right? There's some people that probably are convinced by argumentation. Some people understand, but they have to get past their attachments to a comfortable lifestyle. Some people are suffering so much that, it's the opposite problem, that they don't really have time to think about anything broader than their own pain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, it would be nice to imagine that we could find ways to affect the temperaments that people are experiencing and make awareness of what's happening in the world more accessible to more people.
Yeah, I think there were two things that you mentioned that add on nicely to what I said. One, looking how to not just change people's minds who are like ignorant or in denial, but maybe also like strengthen those who are aware, like techniques and practices that we can point to that like help people who are actually aware of the problem actually do something about it more effectively. So that's an aspect also. And the other one was just how do we reach, if we can't actually change someone's political psychology just like through mass societal nudges or policies, like how do we reach someone on a conservative who has like a conservative mindset or a like half denial kind of mindset? Like it's interesting because like I feel like someone who is conservative should be naturally like drawn to conserving the environment. You would anticipate that. Like I forget who said this, but I remember reading something about how anarcho-primitivism is like the most conservative you can be. It's an anarcho-primitive.
Oh, I definitely said that in the first episode of Fight.
Oh, maybe it was you. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, that makes total sense to me. So like you have that, or at least I have that intuition that should be the case. So like, why is it? Is it because someone on the right is more concerned about conserving culture than the actual like resources or environment? Like there's just a whole bunch of different rabbit holes that we can go down, whether it's on a personal level or of individual transformation or for like broader policy sets and ideas that we can try to implement as society.
So many. I mean, there are so many facets to this question, but I mean, in terms of that particular one, it's my strong impression that some of this comes down to evolutionarily salient threat stimuli versus evolutionarily novel threat stimuli, right? And how conservatism or right-wing politics, these being highly overlapping in American discourse, but I think ultimately kind of distinct conceptual domains, tends to be really it tends to attune to variables that imply threat that have something to do with inner group aggression, right? Like the anticipation of hostilities between nations or between different ethnic groups or whatever, and things like that. But that it seems like right-wing politics is way less adept or responsive to claims about threats that we haven't experienced in the past that don't elicit some sort of like stereotyped behavioral response, like group aggression or something. And yeah, in general, I mean, I think that it's worth saying here at the outset that what we're trying to do ultimately, we're in this phase that this is an iterative process we're in, that this podcast is part of a broader set of initiatives, but that this initiative in particular is concerned with formulating some hypotheses and actually doing some research and ultimately trying to develop some tools for affecting people's perceptions of the world. In that, I guess it's worth noting real quick that Fight Like an Animal, which this podcast is kind of, deriving its momentum from a spin-off project of or whatever, has been very concerned with the political psychology literature. And that literature is very revealing and worth being familiar with, but it's very limited. It's mostly concerned with trait correlations of left-right perceptions and stuff like that. And you do not find questions as rich, like you don't find political understanding as developed or rich as the question that, I just asked, like, what is the temperamental basis of understanding ecological collapse is happening, and that the political system is the reason for that, and that's not a mistake or an accident or a misunderstanding, but indeed intrinsic to the nature of that political system. But it's also, in general, I would say that the political psychology literature is not really very concerned with transformation. It's really just about trait correlations. And so then you have this other, as is so often the case in science, you have these weird disjunctions of knowledge everywhere, right? All these imaginary lines being drawn between forms of knowing. And so you do have this other literature that's concerned with transformative experiences in general. And I think that something that I've gathered from, even though we haven't really begun formulating our hypotheses in any specific way, I gather we both do have this shared sense that some of the literature, for instance, on traumatic, like integration of traumatic experiences and things like that, transformative spiritual experiences, all that, the kind of stuff that makes a scientist question raw materialism, like a very broad range of sort of different transformative experiences have some pretty deep relationship with these shifts in temperament we're talking about with respect to the kind of political perceptions we're concerned with.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I wanted to piggyback on this sense of like the dearth of literature on transformation as related to political philosophy. I think it is just because it's hard, because like it's way easier to like just get some concrete answers of like, this is where people are at right now. Like we can see that this temperament is like this, but the question of like, how do we like change that or put some kind of intervention into that psychology is like, it's way too multifaceted, way too complex for like, and way too individualized, I think, for like there to be a really robust research around that, which is, I guess, what we're obviously trying to attempt. And I did want to add, I mean, there obviously are, I just wanted to touch on some of the things that institutions do to like subtly, I guess, transform people's minds so they don't like tend towards right-wing directions. Like the example I'm thinking of is Germany post World War II. There's a whole like movement to educate people about the Holocaust, trying to put on all these historical markings and educations like into schools, into society. And you can see the end result of that, of Germany being like a prime example of people who are pretty climate aware. You don't see mean, there is an upswing in fascism there, but they haven't like taken control like in some of the other Western nations. And yeah, so there's things like that, which like America hasn't even begun to reconcile things like slavery and like yeah, there's historical problems that you can point to that states have somewhat like done something about to make people's political psychology less unwholesome, I guess. And then there's this an example I want to provide too that I did a bunch of research on was on travel, because that's like a really like when we talk about conservative right-wing kind of thought, or just in general, there's I think a bunch of research about how people change their minds more abruptly if they have some personal experience with other people who actually like talk to them one-on-one. So you can see states like Australia, New Zealand, some parts of Europe have either sponsored like travel plans like a year abroad before you go into college, or just like it's a societal norm like in Australia, like, hey, you're supposed to go for a year before university to go like check out the world, because it is really transformative of your mind. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on those few examples before we go into some of the more individual practices we can talk about.
Oh yeah. I mean, the exquisitely complex tangle of interrelated variables with all this stuff is so, I mean, it's so fun because certainly, right, there's broad social, environmental, political conditions that are going to be hugely predictive of a lot of this stuff. I mean, on some level, I think that the relationship between the literature on the psychological integration of traumatic experience and the capacity to come to terms with the ecological crisis, they share two forms of relationship, one of which is just that in both cases, what we're talking about is confronting something painful. And so there's a shared, a uniform psychology of the avoidance of overwhelming stimuli that has to be engaged, where there's way more work that's been done in the domain of individual trauma than in, the acknowledgement of global catastrophe, but there's a lot of applicability back and forth there. But then the other one is that what we're talking about in many respects is ultimately kind of a developmental question in general, right? And the sort of like broad temperament that allows somebody to even think about these things is massively hindered by living in a society where you're constantly terrified that you're not going to be able to survive, and living in a society where your parents aren't available to interact with you in a way that is evolutionarily anticipated, because they're always at work and they're enraged and exhausted when they are around or whatever, right? And so America has a totally unique psychology. There are all of these different sort of like psychometric means by which we can capture this fact that the humanity is massively psychologically segregated between industrial and non-industrial populations, and then again between Western industrial populations versus other industrial populations, and then between America and all other Western industrialized populations, right? We represent this kind of like this pair
weird of the weird.
Yeah. Right, the weirdest people in the world, as the phrasing goes. And that this obviously provides a sort of broad framework for examining some of the kind of baseline psychological dynamics that are reflective of social conditions that we have to be thinking about. And the trauma literature tells us that whatever kind of like exercises or processes you can conceive of for helping people integrate trauma, they often don't work if there's not some sort of crucial like configuration of variables in place in terms of social support or a baseline sense of like security, safety, whatever. And so I think we're very much talking about something similar, where on one hand, there's this question of like the kind of psychological process you're trying to initiate. And on the other hand, there's this question of the social conditions that have to be in place for the psychological process to occur. And
yeah, I think, using that example of Germany too, it's not just that they've dealt with a history of fascism and have good education with that. They actually have more social support, material support, so people can like actually have the free time to explore their inner life instead of like being forced to work 360 days a year or whatever. And from my own experience too, I wasn't able to do any of this kind of work until I made enough money randomly off of Bitcoin that like I could just be like, oh, I don't need to work. I can actually do something else now. Yeah, it's just a massive, massive factor. It doesn't always, like I know plenty of people who have gone through traumatic transformation and stuff like that without having that material impulse, but it's just a massive, massive factor.
Right, exactly. I mean, I can think of something parallel in my own life where, while I provide an interesting data point of hyper responsiveness and receptivity to ecological threat perceptions and, a propensity for an ecological worldview, I definitely was not. I lived the majority of my adult life in a state of very, very profound, constant trauma response that I was really only able to exit. I was really only able to come to terms with experiences from my childhood, and therefore, sort of transcend their effects when I had an experience of living with a group of people for long enough in a stable enough fashion that I had this one moment of reflection that of just like the simple fact that I was around people that I could more or less trust to be in some form of the relationship that we were having tomorrow, and that nothing totally chaotic or completely unanticipated was likely to happen anytime terribly soon. Really wasn't dramatic in a lot of ways, but it was just this level of stability and social integration that I guess I had never experienced before. So yeah, we're definitely trying to talk about all that stuff. And I don't know, I think I have done quite a bit of storytelling about my own life in Fight Like an Animal that has been intended to, broadly to kind of like illustrate some of the specific dynamics we're talking about, but then very broadly just illustrate this point that the kind of awareness that we're seeking is not a function of rational deliberation or response, exposure to threat messaging. And so today, because your journey to this place that we're both in is very different than mine, I think we're going to try to, to talk some about how you found yourself here. And to me, I guess a thing that I vaguely understand exists, but I don't really know like a timeline for exactly, is it's my understanding that you went through a great deal of your adult life where a project like this wouldn't at all have been a conceivable way that you would have wanted to spend your time. The kind of underlying awareness of the ecological crisis wasn't something that you really possessed. And I'm curious about sort of when that is, like how far back do we have to go to find a version of Tanner who is just not engaged with these questions, who's acting like most people are still acting in some sense or another?
Probably. Well, first, I wanted to say, just as a side comment, it's funny how coming from different places, like Yeah, it's the exact opposite for me, where I was raised by like extremely atheistic parents,
Okay.
not in a new age cult. So it is like the exact opposite childhood conditions. Very isolated, just very, very materialistic.
Right.
um, but yeah, to answer your question, I think I'm 36, and probably as recently as like 4 years ago, this kind of stuff wasn't on my radar.
Okay.
It goes through stages where like definitely from like 18 to 26, I was way, way worse and way down more of the libertarian rabbit holes. And then there's certain things that happened that like I was like, okay, I'm actually not that smart enough to really understand this stuff. So like, I'm not going to be in denial about ecological collapse or anything, but there wasn't like there wasn't an impulse to do anything about it whatsoever either, or think about even trauma or transformation. I think that I was on the perception that like my childhood was relatively okay as recently as like 4 or 5 years ago, actually still. So
So
yeah.
we could say broadly that there's kind of three phases of your adult life. One in which you're sort of committed to a pretty radically different perspective than the one that you currently
Yes.
have, and in many respects sort of felt, a broad sense of endorsement of your developmental context. And then a phase where you felt less committed to a radically disparate worldview than the one you currently have, but like kind of a lack of commitment in general to any sort of particular.
Yeah, just more apathetic, I would describe it as. Like
right.
more concerned about like the daily of like, how do I make money? And just like, as adults do, they graduate college and then get a job and just like start doing things
right.
reflexively.
as adults are expected to do in this society. Yeah. And then a phase of pretty significant personal transformation of a broader variety, one of the corollaries or manifestations of which is the emergence of an ecological worldview, right? That's right. Kind of what we're talking about. So how would you like to talk about this? Should we do it chronologically? Should we begin with, how would you like to dive into this?
That's a good question. I think I'd like to start with like, I think I'd like to start just like starting in college, like end of high school, just like I want to get to like the real reactionary core of who I was, because I think it's important to like outline that perspective and what can be done to change it. Like, because we're obviously trying to change the minds of apathetic people, but also just like actual reactionaries, libertarian reactionaries.
Yeah, totally.
So I got into a pretty good school, like a pretty good college, Dickinson College. It's like a small liberal arts thing.
On the East Coast somewhere?
Yeah, in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So like 2 hours from Pennsylvania or Philadelphia.
Gotcha.
And I can distinctly remember like the first, like before you got to college, they sent you a book and you were supposed to read it, and then we were going to have a group discussion about it when you first got to college, like your first day of college, just to like just to like onboard you onto this is what college is like now or something like that. And I remember the book was it was some anti-racism book about some white girl who lived in the city and was struggling to come to terms with her own racism, even though she was like just a basic liberal. Kind of the stuff that like you've been talking about, like, and Daniel about like just Robin DiAngelo kind of thought. So I remember that was like the first time I was exposed to that kind of thinking, because I grew up middle of fucking nowhere, like 95% white, like upstate New York. So like we didn't really have a lot of minorities there. So to just like read this book and be like, what is this? Like I totally went down on that, what would be called like anti-woke perspective. Like,
Totally.
yeah, naturally reacting to like, yeah, this kind of actual, like I remember I would make those same arguments of like this book is just, it's racist because it's blaming white people for being like, but it was that exact argument. But instead of like transcending that perspective, I just kind of went down a right-wing reactionary path. And that was kind of just because after we had that thing and I got more integrated into college, there really wasn't, I mean, there's a bunch of factors, but I do remember in college, most of my professors were just like neoliberals. Like there was no left-wing perspective even out there, even at like a fairly left-leaning fancy liberal arts school. Actually, on Daniel's podcast, What is Politics, he references one of my old professors, Crispin Sartwell, about like he wrote this article in the Atlantic being like left and right have no meaning anymore and we can't even, there's no point to like
Yeah.
That guy was my political philosophy professor, and he was one of the best professors there. So I'm just trying to highlight the point there of like someone who actually really isn't that well informed about political philosophy or psychology. It was one of the better professors you could have when you were in school. So yeah, I was getting turned off by all that. I wasn't being like, I still had a somewhat of an idealistic view of college of like, yeah, I want to learn things, but like it was just kind of lost. So you do, when you're lost like that, then you like you just go down these rabbit holes looking for people who are thinking like you, and you're really easily scooped up by reactionary sources. Like it's a good thing that this happened to me back in like 2005, 2006, when like the social media and YouTube algorithms weren't available, because like it's, I think it's way, I think it's way easier to psychologically hijack someone nowadays than it was back then. Like I was able to crawl my way out of it pretty, I mean, slowly, but because I didn't have a phone in my hand, just giving me video updates, like, hey, check out what Ben Shapiro is saying right now all the time. But you know, there's another level of personal trauma here too, of like my grandfather was a professor at a college like this, and my mom was, she like had some kind of really big hang-ups about me becoming like a professor like him, because she was traumatized by him, and it's like this endless cycle, right? So she, at the same time I'm like kind of complaining about college, she's like sending me all these reactionary sources. Like I forget who the author was, but there was like this book called 101 Professors or something like that, which would just it would be like, look, all your professors are communists and socialists, and they're all trying to brainwash you. So my own like intellectual disciplination towards what like neoliberal school was back then is being reinforced by my parents at the same time. And so as that's happening, eventually I found online poker. I just started gambling and drinking a ton, but somehow I was just smart enough to make enough money doing that. So like I just dropped out of school and like just started doing that afterwards.
What were you majoring in?
Political science. Like,
oh wow, okay, yeah.
Like I actually had like the path I've been on in the last 4 or 5 years is really rekindling that interest, because like I really did like political philosophy and psychology and all these topics. It just wasn't taught very well. And then like Ron Paul was my guy, even though like I could clearly see like, okay, well, Barack Obama is a corporate shill. And I'm not particularly fond of John McCain or Romney or whoever else was running back then because of religious reasons. So again, just then there was no Bernie Sanders movement. There was just no left. So when you fall out of the mainstream discourse of politics, what was left is just, I was reading Ayn Rand and I was following Ron Paul and hoping he would become president. And then when his campaign ended and I started playing poker, I just kind of fell off the map entirely in terms of politics. It was just like I didn't know where to turn, and then I need to make a living, and this is pretty fun anyway. So
in that respect, your life really is a case study in this stuff that Daniel and I keep talking about. I actually, just before we started this conversation, uploaded yet another conversation between he and I that once again goes into how the academy is really set up in this way it serves a central function in preserving the radically right-wing nature of our society by making the distinction between political tendencies utterly opaque, even to people who are assiduously seeking out a coherent understanding of exactly that. I'm an informal collector of accounts that different people have from majoring in political science of the totally insane things that their professors have said to them about what left and right even mean, many of which are some variety of, they have no meaning, just, it's like the Crips and the Bloods, right? It's just, there's no functional fundamental distinction. It's just two teams these various political spectra that different people will post on Twitter or whatever from their undergraduate days, where it's stuff literally like anarchism and monarchism are next to each other on the far right, or just stuff like that. And so it's on the one hand, there's these very, very powerful, always unarticulated. The book Disciplined Minds does a masterful job of talking about how what it is to be a professional and to be an academic is to assimilate a broad set of intricate set of rules about how to behave and speak that are never explicitly articulated, right? And how there's this very complex set of guiding principles that inform how politics is discussed in the academy that utterly obscure the real differences between political perspectives and just make everything totally incoherent and incomprehensible. And then simultaneously, there's this very specific tendency related to exclusively to language and, symbolic modes of action. It never has anything to say about who owns what or who has power to, decide who gets to eat or who goes into a cage or anything like that. But there's this tendency that comes out of hyper academic, postmodern, critical theory gibberish that is basically like a statement to the effect that people who've had different experiences of socialization are utterly incapable of comprehending one another or having any kind of coherent argument because they just don't share terms of experience. And, it basically sets up this set of linguistic and behavioral protocols that don't make any sense, that are what people associate with leftism. What is leftism? Oh, it's saying that Black people and white people live in totally non-continuous epistemic domains and there's no hope that they can ever communicate, or that men and women or gay and straight or whatever, it's like it's saying that there's just like these sort of that there's no truth. There's only the identity of the speaker. And people have this really immediate reaction where they're like, I don't think that's true. I think that there's some fundamental way in which we all kind of do actually share a basic neural architecture and live in some version of the same reality. And of course, people have different experiences, and that's going to inform what they think. But I think we kind of can talk to each other in that and people get told that that's what leftism is. It's this crazy nonsense. You know, it's this thing that doesn't make any sense, that any idiot can see doesn't make sense. And that really, really informs what happens next.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There were good aspects of it. What I think was like really lacking was two things. One, just like fundamental political philosophy, like
Right.
what is left and right, like those kind of questions, like why, like like those kind of questions aren't really even asked. They're just kind of like, I mean, Daniel does a fantastic job of just describing. They're just words. They're just kind of floating around.
Totally.
Also, class was not really hit on in my school. Like the whole economics department, just like very much a big part of my school was international business. So like that kind of discussion about class was totally absent. But I do want to highlight like where it was good, because there's good aspects of academia that you want to preserve for sure. And like the characterization of colleges being like brainwashing institutions for cultural Marxists is the complete opposite. It's too right wing at college.
Absolutely.
And too centrist. It's the complete opposite. But at one point I was playing poker and I got scammed on this one website for like $200,000 or something. And I was like, I need a job. So like I went back to school when I was like 25, 26. And one, I had some really good classes there, but also it helped for me to go to school at a later date. This kind of just like also just dovetails with what I was talking about, like, you know, in Australia and parts of Europe, they let you go travel for a year or two, gain some life experience before like school becomes relatable. Because I remember when I went back, I was like, I think I want to major in philosophy because this is way more interesting to me now than like it was when I was 18 and just a like dumb bro just filled with cum and like wanting to party all the time.
Right.
But I remember this was one of the turning points I had this one class with like a professor of media who did a really good job of illustrating how media would frame like two sides of a debate as like equally valid in order to like get clicks and likes, because you want that conflict. That's what they're interested in selling, is the conflict. They're not actually going for truth. And yeah, when I took, so there are classes like that at my school that were like, oh, this is actually pointing me in the right direction. But like I said, the main thing is that these kind of classes are kind of fractured. They're segmented. They're not part of a whole like comprehensive discourse on politics, which is, again, the biggest problem is that, you know, when you take a political philosophy course, they're going to focus on people like Plato, who's basically a fascist, and like Western philosophers like Locke and private property, and like that's where the real racism is there. Like they're actually just focusing on this one narrow lineage of philosophical thought instead of encompassing, like, there's all sorts of different interesting thoughts about governance in indigenous societies and like East Asian collectivism. And just recently, I like in the last year or two, I've just been watching tons of stuff on anarchism and Marxism and those movements. And I was just like, this is so fascinating. And none of it was discussed in my school. Very much like a Fukuyama kind of end of history kind of environment, especially back in 2005, was the vibe in my political science department. Like, we're just hanging out, like waiting for everything to be democratic capitalism. Like, that's what we're doing. And I remember that message did have an effect on me of just like, well, if that's the case, like, I enjoy thinking about philosophical fundamentals. And if this is the case, I guess I'm just going to go gamble and travel. If you're just telling me this is what's won and there's no reason to like think about anything else politically.
Yeah, I think that I mean, there's tons of different aspects of this. I definitely spent a huge amount of time characterizing different elements of this, and receive pretty frequent correspondences from people who are either academics or who went through some graduate program or whatever, who are really responsive to my critiques of the academy from outside and are like, yeah, thank you. I feel like I was in a cult when I was in grad school or whatever. But I mean, I think another way that the academy and then the way that it's talked about just utterly obscures the nature of power in our society is that, I mean, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, whatever it is, of hours of media where people are offering their various takes on the ostensible leftist bias in the academy. And you will never hear a single one of them actually break it down by department in terms of data and be like, is there though? Like, which departments are we talking about? And like, what exactly are the...
If you define leftism as liberalism, which is what these sources do, then, yeah, exactly. They're obfuscating like the data that way.
But even in those terms, what so many people are so utterly unfamiliar with is that there is a subset of disciplines of academic specializations that skew strongly right with respect to the background population. And check it out. Those are the academic specializations that are the pathways to inhabiting roles of institutional power in every mass hierarchical society, regardless of its superficial ideological descriptions. Whether we are talking about the Soviet Union or the United States of America, institutional power, it has a very narrow range of paths that are like law, economics, administration, engineering, right? And those disciplines have a very distinct psychology. You see this in the actual academic practice, how they're all concerned. None of them are concerned with open-ended inquiries or generating knowledge for its own sake. They are all concerned with the application of existing formulae for the manipulation of the physical world in some fashion or another. And then psychologically, they're inhabited by people who skew heavily right in a number of, like psychological traits that lack explicit relationship to political perception in any logical sense, but are highly predictive of political perceptions. And, it's like if you break down participation in terrorist groups by academic specialization and stuff like that, these same disciplines, engineering, law, business, they massively disproportionately produce right-wing terrorists, not just, way more so than the general population. It's like engineers are the single demographic that are most likely to be right-wing terrorists of either the Western or Islamic variety, and engineers are like, it's like Stalin complained that all the socialists had been replaced by engineers. And many books, like, for instance, Scott's Seeing Like a State, are devoted to talking about how people in institutional power all kind of share this particular kind of hyper-reductive, hyper-schematic, extractive utilitarian worldview.
Well, it's all just, I like to reduce it of just seeing people and things as objects. Like that's the
That's
mindset.
what it is. That's what it
Yeah.
is. Exactly. Exactly.
That just permeates all of that. And just to add like another layer of nihilism upon this is just like, my school is it was one of the good ones. Like a liberal arts education has shown like, if you get a good one, it is predictive of more egalitarian mindsets. But like, that's not the majority. The majority of schools are like business schools, and they're all just like cranking out these guys.
Totally. And then, I mean, I would just add real quick, like, I think something that informs sort of our broad inquiry with this project is my sense that the kind of opposite end of that psychological trait syndrome of seeing the world as a collection of objects, right? Of these, the world is this external thing, and it's just dead things that can be moved around in various ways towards utilitarian ends, right? That's kind of the opposite of the embodied state of being that we, I think, are sort of looking for, it's like in terms of being able to see the world. And so a lot of the psychology that I've become familiar with that has such an apparent presence in certain academic disciplines, I mean, I initially came to it through this fundamental question of what it was that compelled people to participate in the so-called radical environmental movement that was my political home in my youth. And, I started out with this awareness that whatever it was I was looking for, I knew that it was a sense of continuity with the world. I knew that what was motivating people was this sense that was phrased in many different ways, but that they weren't separate from the world, they were part of it, and that when damage was done to the world, when a mountain was strip mined or a forest was clear cut, something was happening to them, to their bodies. And, through that inquiry, from that starting point, I became familiar with all of these various conceptualizations of these subject-object distinctions, materialism versus panpsychism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's very much a divide that's present in the academy. And I think it illustrates how you can receive professional training that has no explicit political content, that's just telling you how to see the world and solve problems in some physical domain or another, or purely symbolic domain for that matter. But the way that it trains you to just think about the world in terms of the subject and object really, really inculcates this sense of distance that prevents an ecological worldview from manifesting.
Well, I mean, and this goes into what we're saying about trauma responses, that kind of objectifying mindset is kind of a trauma response, because like it's to occupy that kind of like cold, efficient, like subject object duality. Like, it's comforting when you're not comfortable feeling your feelings. Like, this is why I became a poker player. Like, I obviously, in addition to the political problems in academia, there was no like now in schools, they have meditation classes and all sorts of other things you can do to kind of like break those barriers. But back when I was in school, that was definitely not the case. So I just kind of like, I can clearly see the time where I just like made a decision. I'm like, well, I'm just going to embrace this materialistic part, because I've just got no answers. And this works. It works in the society. It gets me money, allows me to do the things I want to do. And it was just completely conditioned into that response, even though my like natural predisposition wasn't towards that way of thinking. But since so many people in American society are traumatized, and then they contribute to the system, and there's just no way, there's no outlets, we just keep making more and more of the same thing, and it snowballs.
Man, that's so true. I've never thought about it in precisely these terms before, but it's right. There's that striking symmetry between the experience of having something too terrible to endure happen to you, where you're like, okay, nope, I'm gonna watch this from 10 feet above my body, and between that in the worldview that is so characteristic of the technocratic orientation, where it's like,
It's
the
completely
disembodied
dissociated from, yeah,
I, yeah,
exactly.
the God's eye view.
Oh
Totally.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Completely the same thing. Yep.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I did that for 10 years or whatever, just played poker in that mindset. I remember I had kind of transcended a lot of the right wing stuff, especially the second time I went back to school. And especially taking that media class, because I remember one of the examples she pointed out is that there's a scientific consensus here of climate change being exclusively man-made, like 97% or whatever. This is back in like 2008. Yet the media still frames it as like, let's have a debate on climate change. And I remember like seeing that and be like, Jesus, that's fucked up. Never really like questioned the science. Yeah. I saw some interesting tweet recently of like, if you're a libertarian, you have to do like one of four things when it comes to climate. You can either like deny it, you can say like it's an exception, like libertarianism is fine, but government intervention in like climate is fine, because it's because you need to like protect property, and property is going to be damaged by climate. Which was definitely like the area I occupied of like, well,
Okay.
yeah, like this didn't really threaten my philosophy that much, the climate apocalypse. I didn't have a framework of like understanding how the extraction of resources derivative of like property and corporations owning all that property at the with the help of the government was like the root cause of all of that. But yeah, but it since like yeah, I didn't have that leftist kind of framework. I just was like, okay, I'm just going to go play poker. And, someone, if I can figure out like from a libertarian perspective, like that we still need to do something about climate change, like other people can.
Right.
And the other thing that was also going on too is that there was just like a ton of naivete about like, oh, there's adults in the room that can understand these complex problems, which I can very clearly see now was also just like when we talk about in psychotherapy, just transference. Like that's how I saw my parents as like caregivers, and nothing bad happened to me. So I never since I never had investigated that until recently, like I just transfer that on to political discourse too, and how governments work. I was like, oh yeah, people know what they're doing. I can do what I want and not have to worry about any of this and not take any ownership. Yeah. So did that for roughly like 10 years until I like I was playing on this poker site that was paying me in Bitcoin, and I just like kept them because I had enough money to do what I wanted to do. I was still traveling and playing tournaments around the world. And back in like December 2017, it skyrocketed like to a whole bunch. And I had like 60 or 70 of these coins.
Oh, wow.
And I just sold all of them immediately because like,
good move.
Yeah, well, I also just wasn't an ideologue about it either. I didn't really understand it. I was just like, why do people want these things? It makes sense in the context of poker and probably other illegal activities, but I can't think of another reason why like this is useful. But I had friends in the poker community, man. They when it first went up, they just were like, no, it's going to 100,000. Like, this is the future. Like, didn't sell. Just, yeah. And this was before I learned about all of the environmental impacts of Bitcoin mining and all that stuff. Yeah, that's a whole another fun rabbit hole we can go down to, because like the crypto stuff has such roots in like libertarian gold bug like thinking that I've only again learned retroactively, but I happen to be the like unknowing beneficiary of. Because it was after then when I made $1 million off of that or so that I just was like, okay, I don't need to play poker. I don't need to do like, I can keep traveling if I want, but like I can just buy some property, rent out a place, and then just do whatever I want, and that'll be enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that kind of allowed you that sense of fundamental security that whatever the proportion is, but most people I see around me in the fabric of daily life I encounter emphatically do not possess, right? That sense of baseline security kind of allowed you to experience things that were inaccessible when you were in a more direct survival mode, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's that. And the other thing too that is important, and I hinted at this earlier, was all the traveling I had done had exposed me to all these new perspectives and possibilities and ways of thinking about the world. Like I love traveling. This is why I did all this research and almost wrote a book of just like the benefits travel can have on people's psychology. Like it was really fundamental for me. And it was through that way too. Like I found, like I was part of these digital nomad groups that would go traveling around the world. Most of them now I can like go look back at and just like, oh, those were just, I was just trauma bonding with a bunch of people running away from their problems. Like that's what was happening. But it was also like the thing that you mentioned too, of like, oh, I found a group of people I feel safe with for the very first time, like over an extended period of time, because you go through all these crazy travel experiences and you really learn to trust one another. But it was through people in that group I heard about like meditation retreats, ayahuasca experiences, all this like these alternative counterculture things that would never been on my radar if I just played poker and like kind of stayed in the States and like existed in my hometown playing music or whatever. So when it was time to so when I actually had that financial security, the very first thing I wanted to do was go do ayahuasca, because I had heard so much from my friends in this nomad group when I was in Peru and Bolivia. So yeah, and the ayahuasca experience, that was the first time I had that like any sense of spirituality or like a non-material worldview, because and when I actually had that feeling you described of like, oh, I'm part of an ecosystem, like it was the very first time I just had that thought. And that's just because the experience is just, at least the one I had the first time, was just so like dramatic. So impactful. That everything kind of stems from there, because after that I was just really interested in, like, I almost completely abandoned a materialistic worldview and just started doing all the spiritual stuff, all the yoga, all the meditation, which like now I look back upon as like that materialism does have a good aspect of it, especially like if we talk about science and understanding the world, which I think too many people go off the deep end of the spiritual path sometimes. But like, for me, it was really, really transformational. Just what you expect like there's already research on this of like psychedelics being that thing that always seems to conclusively give someone a sense of ecological awareness.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, yeah, that's central to our inquiry for sure. You know, there's the earlier generation of which, you know, my father was certainly a part, where they had encounters with psychedelic drugs and they were like, oh, this is just categorically the answer. And it's really just this simple, you know, it's like everybody just needs to get real high. And that's not quite the case. You know, it's certainly true that people can maintain some really appalling worldviews while, you know, just inundating their neurotransmitters with all kinds of wild molecules, you know. But yeah, it does seem like there's something about, you know, if we were like very generally talking about the kinds of transformations we're thinking about as allowing for a greater range of, you know, like a greater degree of perceptual plasticity for at the neural level, more fluid communication between different brain regions, whatever, you know, psychedelics are this catalyst that they really matter and they really are decisive for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think there's also like very little downside. I think like there's I mean, like the worst you can be is like an eco-fascist, which is like bad.
Sure,
like,
yeah, totally.
but at least you might be one of those conservatives that's actually worried about conserving the environment.
And that's something, right? Like, I guess we could maybe make the distinction between that sort of, you know, authoritarian worldview or whatever, and the set of emotional needs that seem to be being met in a lot of people who subscribe to a right-wing worldview, which it sounds like was never really the case with you, where it's like compensating for a sense of inadequacy or threat, or providing, you know, some degree of like almost a sense of really like vengeance against, you know, like it's indulging.
Well, I can for me, I just got all of that out in poker. Like the whole thing is extremely competitive. Like, like I'm just literally attacking people, taking their money like for nights on end. And I can clearly see it like that gave me a sense of like empowerment that allowed me to do those things, because like I can point to my brother who is at the very least, like obsessed with Jordan Peterson. He did vote for Trump back in 2016. I don't know if he is now, but like he had no such outlet where he could like show his like he had no feedback where he was being like, you're good at something. Where that sense of insecurity was just always there.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's really pretty fundamental for a lot of people in terms of like the, you know, like the psych research shows a pretty small effect size, although it is there, where there's, you know, there's a negative relationship between self-esteem and right-wing worldviews. But I do feel like for some subset of people who maintain a right-wing perspective, it definitely, and especially people who are really ethnocentric and stuff like that, it really seems like it's a basis for superiority for people who otherwise lack one, right?
Yeah.
You know.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly what my brother described. I don't know how widespread that is of a phenomenon, although I would probably like think it's pretty like it's very coherent with people who are attracted to Jordan Peterson and his worldview and his message, I think.
Right.
So, but yeah. So yeah, after, well, is there anything else on psychedelics worth mentioning? I guess, yeah. It's funny because since that first ayahuasca one, for me anyway, they haven't been nearly as impactful.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of nuance there of what goes into it. But yeah, you were going to say something about
I
have
a couple of questions. So you said that you did have some experience of this fundamental frame shift from the world is out there to, oh, I'm the world, I'm part of this broader thing, right? And I'm wondering, what was sort of like the emotional valence of that? Like, I know for me that was simultaneously the most beautiful and painful realization, right? I was simultaneously like, wow, I'm part of this amazing complex reality, and also just this tragic, this, like, people will often talk about their politics being some, coming into an awareness of some aspect of the world after which they feel like they're always grieving or something like that. And it was certainly the case for me that,
Yeah, for me, the overwhelming feeling was actually just relief of like, okay, something matters, like something means anything.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
just constantly being hounded by this sense of nihilism, like just so pervasive.
That's so interesting.
So that was like the main feeling of ayahuasca. But what you're talking about did emerge later, after I did a really long meditation retreat, where, like, because the way it worked on ayahuasca and psychedelics is you only get like a picture of that. It doesn't like stick. You can just get like at least for me anyway, the first time I did it, I just got the very first sense that there was something more than me and something I was connected. Like, I just had an experience, and then actually like integrating that and understanding it was a different matter. And like Ram Dass talks about this a lot, like just like psychedelics, like they're just a rocket that takes you to the moon, but you don't stay on the moon. Whereas the more like steady psychological methods like meditation or therapy or whatever, it can get to that point. So it wasn't until I like did a long retreat, just like a few months afterwards, that I really started to be like, oh my God, all the things I've done are wrong.
Gotcha.
Yeah, a lot of grief, but also just a lot of guilt too. Of just like, oh my God, like I was a part of this whole system. And then just a lot of pain too, because I just didn't know, like, why am I like this? Like, why did this happen to me? Like, why did I end up this way? Was I just always bad? Like, those kind of questions are what came up for me.
I see what you mean. It's interesting to hear that stated as a sort of general categorical thing about psychedelics. I have thought this, but I haven't done like a ton of psychedelic research, and I certainly haven't done a ton of psychedelics. And my observations with my very limited experiences has been kind of that, where it's like you'll have these experiences where you're kind of like, okay, I went to the top of the mountain and I spoke with the universe, and now I've come down from the mountain and I just have that insight, right? And it's like, no, actually, it turns out that in a few months, you got to go back up to the mountain and like have some version of the same conversation with the universe and be like, so is everything still one? Is it fundamentally okay that I'm going to die? And is it my job to defend life on Earth? And like, yeah, okay, cool. I guess I'll go back down the mountain and keep on rolling or whatever. But, it is really interesting though, because it's pretty easy, at least for me, in those experiences, to think that that something is being accessed that is just going to be totally enduring, but it's kind of not. It kind of slips away in just this sort of like intangible day by day kind of sense, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I can think of I mean, a lot of the retreat centers I did ayahuasca in, and like specifically, I can think of a shaman here in Panama that I met. He's like a modern shaman, like Trustafarian kind of dude. But like, he just keeps taking ayahuasca to get back to that point in order to do anything, and he kind of has to. Because he just doesn't really have. It's not really. I mean, this is something I'd love to explore. Like I tried to do that, but it didn't work for me for whatever reason. Like, if I could have just done ayahuasca a whole bunch of times and stayed there and been like happy and okay with the world, I would have done that, but it just never worked but for him, it was like, that's what I do. And I don't need to do psychotherapy. I don't need to like think about political issues, anything like that. It was just ayahuasca. And I saw that consistently over, because I've like experimented with every kind of spiritual method or healing technique or things with diet, like everything. And I can see, like, for some people, there's this guy in Jamaica who's like, he's super traumatized, but he just eats raw vegan and everything's fine. And he doesn't have to like do anything else. Like, it's really bizarre to me sometimes that like, some people will just find the thing that works, that keeps them stable from whatever cesspool of pain that is like lurking in the background. Which maybe you could say that was the case for me with poker, because that definitely did. But like, I think it's fundamentally different because they're doing like they're doing spiritual activities and hard things with their bodies. You would expect a lot of emotional release and things would come up, and like, yeah, for whatever reason, none of those things stuck with me. I did. So, this is the this is definitely the route I want to go down. But I remember during that ayahuasca journey too, the very first one, I had this vision of not being type 1 diabetic anymore. And that like really inspired me too, of like, oh, I can, that gives me meaning, like, oh, I can do something like that. And I've only been type 1 diabetic since I was like 22. It was adult onset. And it was literally the exact same time I decided to be a poker player.
Yep.
So like, I think I don't think it's unrelated that when I decided to start like, okay, I'm just going to start objectifying the world and play poker, I got a physical illness. So yeah, after that happened, I was like, okay, I'm going to work really hard to try and like change this and heal my diabetes, and we're going to do this thing. And I was, since I was starting in the Andes, I started doing lots of like high altitude mountaineering, and then I got into Wim Hof. I don't know if you know who that is. He does, yeah, like lots of just throwing myself in icy freezers. Like literally, I said I tried everything. I tried raw vegan. I tried all these things. And the only thing that stabilized my blood sugar at all, like all these things actually made everything worse. They all made it worse. And the only thing that made it better was psychotherapy, which does stabilize my blood sugars to some extent. I haven't healed my type 1 at all yet, but that's because there's a lot of trauma there that needs to be released that I had no idea was there until like 2019, 2020. Yeah, just like 2 years ago.
And was it the actual psychotherapy that started to make those memories accessible? I know you said something about having a meditation experience where you were kind of scanning your body.
Yeah, like that goes in line with like the type 1 diabetes, because this was on one of those long retreats where you do the body scans, and there's like this just tight lump basically where my pancreas is, and I'm constantly looking into that. And I had just like a really like I'm just staring at that spot for hours on end, and something loosened to where I had a panic attack for just hours. It was so long, like really out of the ordinary kind of thing, but there weren't any memories associated with that. And that's like, definitely it was a traumatic memory that was being triggered, but because the context of like Buddhist meditation is like, you just sit with whatever emotion is coming up and just be equanimous with it. Like there wasn't any further investigation and any further memory. I just like remember being extremely scared and full of anxiety, but I had no idea where it came from.
So when you did start to get a sense of where some of that pain and terror might might originate from, that was in the course of psychotherapy. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, what was happening in like 2018 is that I was trying all these absurd healing techniques, and like all they were doing, especially the meditation and the yoga, was just giving me more body awareness.
Yeah.
And and because I was doing that, I was just in more pain that I was like, where is this coming from? So I had, at the end of 2019, I was like in a hospital for like weeks on end. Like I had lost like 60 pounds. I was skeletal, just like no one could figure out what was wrong with me. And I had no idea either. I was just like, there's got to be some like very obscure nerve thing or something to explain this. I have no idea what's happening. But like I saw every specialist for months, and just they're like, yeah, everything's fine. You're just like diabetic. And so I actually went to therapy simply because I didn't want to live anymore, just because I was in so much pain. Like it wasn't, I didn't even want to investigate childhood or psychotherapy because I didn't think anything happened there. I thought, like, I was just like, I'm existentially in a lot of pain and I need someone to talk to about it. So it was like, yeah, just kind of a lucky accident that I found a very good psychotherapist. To directly answer your question, though, it's more than just the psychotherapy, but I think that is the most crucial aspect. The other things that mattered were like all this was happening when I was like staying at my parents in New York. So there was all these unconscious triggers and PTSD going on too. So I got away from all of that and was in Florida and then Panama. And I also got a dog, which was really important for some reason. I can really like connect with dogs and having any kind of like sense of this animal is safe. So that was pretty important. And my partner too was somehow didn't leave me during that entire time, because even though I was projecting onto her all the time without like knowing it, like having her support was really important too.
What was like the kind of subjective register as these memories started to emerge? Was it kind of like, did you have experiences where it was sort of like fragmentary images and sounds and sensations and stuff like that, like a sort of like disjointed quality to it? Or
for me, it was way more dramatic. It was not at all gradual like that. Like there was like 5 months of psychotherapy where we started to investigate my childhood, and I was starting to like ask questions of like, like what I was telling you before about my mom and my grandfather. Like he was a professor, and she tried to like basically brainwash me into a right-wing perspective when I was in college. I was like, oh, that's kind of upsetting, because I like, it made me like distance myself from intellectual life, like all that. So there's like, I'm going through some like awareness of my conditioning, but nothing like nothing truly traumatic really happened until I was in therapy one day, and I started remembering something that happened to me with my dad in the shower. I was like, oh, and my psychotherapist was like, do you want to look into that memory like a little bit more? I was like, sure, yeah. I remember just being like really confused there. And then it was like a bomb went off, and I remembered the sexual abuse, the rape, like I remembered all of it, like as viscerally as you could possibly imagine it. And like, yeah, from that point on, it was like, oh, this is why everything's so fucked up in my body. Like, yeah. It was like a bomb was dropped, and like, oh, I have answers now. It wasn't like fragmented or
So you really didn't
manageable.
go through that thing of sort of questioning and getting like tentative indications that some people have. You just didn't know, and then you knew.
Yeah. Uh, since that first one, it had been like, it's been more like how you're describing it, where it's been
Yeah.
more like other memories have been more hard to like describe, and it's harder for me to get a sense of what has happened to it. But that first one was so big that I don't really have any doubt. It's just like, it's harder to, there's just so many memories there that are so painful. It's hard to do them like accept very gradually and fragmentedly.
And is that kind of the nature of the process, though? Is that on some level you have to kind of integrate all of these by going through them in some sense, having some degree of a process of reliving them and sort of like sorting them out?
Well, I think it's very individualized. I think for me, yes, I think it helps to have like bigger, more traumatic re-experiencings, just because I have lots of psychological tricks that I play that keep me in denial.
Yeah.
And they will continually do that unless I actually, like, when I actually re-experience something like, oh, that happened, then they relent, and I feel way more at peace of like, okay, yes, there's not this constant sense of questioning.
Yeah.
But I know lots of people in childhood sexual abuse groups I've been in who like barely remember anything.
Right.
But they're getting lots of support, and they seem like there's a lot of healing going on. So I think it just really depends on your personal system and what works for you for that kind of stuff. Like, it's kind of a cliche, but it is true. Just like everyone has their own journey to go on this kind of stuff. There's no like one size fits all kind of thing.
Oh, for sure, for sure. But for you, it's like the reality is essentially that you had this decisive kind of entry into this where you're like, okay, this is like I contain this collection of memories and their associated physical, responses. And now you're kind of in this process where you're still processing them. You're still sort of like getting through them and like getting to that point where they lose their power over you in some way.
Yeah, for sure. Like I just talked about it last week with you, of just like having one of the most absurd experiences of just literally reverting to an infant state. It was so bizarre. But the main thing is that even though like I'm still in the process of healing or integrating or whatever, there was a period of time from like late 2019 to like mid 2021, early 2022, where it's just like I couldn't do anything. Like I just went to Panama and like rested for months.
Yeah. And that gets into that thing where, I mean, you needed to have $1 million in Bitcoin to even like let the defenses down and go through I know that was, for me, it was like the social support thing was essential, but then it was like I was in college and I was living off of student loans. So I had to keep going to school and taking like calculus classes and stuff for the months that I spent remembering all this stuff that happened. And I mean, I was sleeping like on average, seriously, an hour a night,
Yeah.
And it was really, I was like, okay, if this goes on for very much longer, I'm going to end up homeless, like I'm not going to be okay. And I think probably a lot of people just can't access things that they otherwise would be able to because they have to function.
Yeah, it's so fucked in that sense. Like I remember when in 2020 Andrew Yang was like, yeah, we should just give people like UBI. I was like, that's the best thing, honestly. Although now my perspective is a little bit more nuanced because I feel like if you introduce a UBI, like everyone's just going to raise their rents and like you're going to have the same problem. But like,
yeah, totally.
yeah. But fundamentally, it was like that's the idea that would really jumpstart a lot of momentum for people doing work on their traumatic experiences. And like it wasn't until like I started coming out of it like late 21, early 22 that I actually started to grasp like the severity of the ecological crisis. And that was just simply because I saw something really hard and I couldn't see in my own personal history. Like, because I could do that now, I could actually like research like the actual state of things and not have any psychological blinders that would protect me from seeing how grim reality actually was, because that was always happening whenever I looked into climate change or anything like that.
So it's really just that general capacity in your case for confronting painful truths transferred across domains from the shattering experiences of childhood sexual abuse to the shattering experience of realizing we're living in a dying world, basically.
Yeah. So like, it's funny. It's like, I'm like, oh yes, I transcended enough of my childhood pain. I can function in the world, and there's like, there's not going to be a world now, and you gotta grieve that. And it's like, fuck you. This is how this works. But yeah, I mean, I'm a very lucky case in the sense of like, I got a really good psychotherapist. I got lots of financial support just by dumb luck. Like, I'm sure there's, I got to travel, like things that most people don't get to do. Like, I'm quite an outlier where you can, I think with my anecdotal case, you can like point to a lot of things that are important, but in terms of like actually being someone able like to act on them, it's like, there's so many lucky things that needed to just fall into place for me to be able to access this.
That's how it feels. It feels like there are many paths to the capacity to comprehend ecological reality, but that all of them are fairly narrow, that all of them require these fairly acute configurations of variables in these very like specific ways. And yeah, that's a really giant problem, but that's the only way to explain.
I know.
I mean, that's the only way to explain this crazy world we're living in, right? You know, this insane reality of non-responsiveness that we're witnessing.
I think, like I mentioned this before, but it's important in this podcast to investigate people who might be aware of it, of the crisis, but actually can't act on it also just because they're so traumatized. Like that kind of like I feel like that's what's mostly happening in these social movements that you describe, and like group meetings where people just get triggered by like minor infractions, although they're involved in the climate like resistance in some sort of capacity. They can't think strategically because they're just getting triggered constantly by other things.
Well, a very interesting thing, I don't know if it's in this research I'm reading right now, but I organized for a number of years with that fellow David Osborne, whose PhD thesis I sent you about the worldviews of participants in direct action movements pertaining to climate. And you know, those movements are like honestly pretty good case studies in, I mean, it's a range, and I don't want to diminish the extent to which a lot of the people he interviewed have done some very brave, extraordinary, statistically very rare things. But, you know, a lot of the like groups that people he interviewed are involved with are kind of like pretty good paradigmatic case studies in these weird dysfunctional processes that characterize social movements that prevent them from really getting anything done. And one of the things that, I don't know if he talks about it in his thesis, but he would talk about it when he was doing his research, was in the group that we organized with. He was like, what's interesting is we talk about a lot of things, but one thing we don't talk about is climate change. And it was really true. It's like we could talk about like blockading a refinery or something, but we really never had group level conversations about kind of where the crisis was at, what we thought realistic trajectories of it. I mean, like it was really noticeable. And I just think people couldn't. I mean, I just think that the level of trauma that was kind of visible in those groups was like, okay, let's start with a conversation about having a potluck to talk about how to evade surveillance. Okay, let's get into a fight and like invoke a bunch of weird oppression language, and that was mostly, it's like exactly what you're saying. Like people were just in a much more reactive kind of like a place of primary traumatization that really didn't allow us to talk about the very big picture, painful fundamentals. And this is this rare group of people who are at least capable of showing up at a meeting and being like, looks like the world is ending. What should we do? Right.
Yeah, I remember it sticks out to me that one of those podcast episodes you did of the chant at some anarchist meeting of like, your words are violence or something like that. I was just like, what? They're at an anarchist meeting and they're what? Yeah. But it's funny because this kind of goes into your whole thing about temperament. It seems like this, it might all be trauma too, but I think there's also just like some kind of biological predisposition for this too. Because I just recently watched this documentary on the anarchist Civil War and the Spanish Civil War. Right. Back in the 30s, where there was actually there was a real chance the left could have won there.
Totally.
Which I would, again, this is nothing they teach you in school, but it's like really fascinating and very, very important if you're looking to actually do something practical in terms of politics. But like what stuck out for me in that documentary was this key moment where the fascist party had started to organize and centralize and start to win a lot of the battles because they were just more efficient that way. And the anarchists and the communists just could not agree to like either keep fighting on a voluntary participatory guerrilla method like the anarchists, or centralize the army and start training it like the communists. And it was just like this fundamental divide that made them schism and make them lose the Civil War right there. And I don't even know who's right, because like the communists were like, yo, if you want to win, we have to be more centralized. And I was like, yeah, I agree with that. But then like you saw these are Soviet communists that are coming in, and the anarchists are like, no, I don't want to. You see what's going on in the Soviet Union? Like, I don't want, even if we do win, I don't want to recapitulate that system. So like we can't, it's just an extremely difficult problem to solve.
So, yeah, I mean, I absolutely emphatically agree that there's a temperamental thing here that we see within contemporary political movements that transcends kind of the level of pain that anybody's in. Right. That definitely, has something to do with this really broad tendency to kind of want to disengage from concrete strategic deliberation into these internal assessments and these sort of interminable internal conflicts and stuff like that. But I also will always hasten to note that I think that the arrow of causation is bidirectional here. I think that people are somewhat powerless because they fight, but I also think they fight because they're powerless. And that you can see that in the way that the right will, like after the 2022 election, started to act like the left in a lot of ways, where they started really like attacking each other after they had like had a pretty significant electoral, defeats, where they were really like kind of on each other's case in a way that you don't normally see. And it's just because they felt that fundamental despair. In the Spanish Civil War, you will see a lot of analyses about how it's supposedly some just like inability of people to get it together and come to some decision or another. A lot of that stuff is kind of bullshit. And there
I'm not surprised.
is a fundamental reality that the fascists got material support from fascist states in other places, and the anarchists didn't. And so they were fighting with totally different, like a lot of it was just that they didn't have an air force while the fascists did and stuff like that. And then the famous conflicts that people focus on are the stuff that's happening once they're starting to realize like, oh, this doesn't look good,
Okay,
like, we're all gonna die, and so that's that's both are true, but you have to have an integrated understanding of both of these aspects of.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, that it probably wasn't fundamental to them losing, but like it was still there. And I can still, what was interesting to me is that I can see this in what you described, but also just recently I did this, I just went to this, and I told you about this before, but this is, I think it'll be funny to recapitulate it now. I went to the Green Party's annual meeting like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, because I was thinking like, oh, Cornel West, they finally have like an intriguing candidate, and this is interesting. But literally both of the things, one at the annual meeting, workshops and talks were just being derailed from the most minor trigger events. Like one got derailed because some guy needed to know this local official's position on reparations, and the local official he's literally like a school board member, like what wasn't at all in a position to make it, like whatever his position was, it did not matter. And so that workshop got that was like an important workshop too, because it was like, how do we organize at a local level to take positions of power? And no, we don't get to talk about that. And this speaks to like the pathological tendency on the left to be obsessed with harm reduction. There was a workshop on like the history of fascism and what we can do about it, seeing it because it's reemerging. So the very title is, history of fascism. And when you go into the workshop, the guy has a slideshow up and there's like a swastika. And this one person just flipped out. Like, how do you not have a trigger warning for the fucking swastika? And just kept derailing like the entire meeting. Sorry. It was just like, it's called the history of fascism. Like, what? That's not enough of a trigger warning. But also, but also this dynamic of like centralizing versus decentralizing is fundamentally derailing the Green Party's ability to organize, I think, because what's the example? Yeah, there's people in the Green Party who do not want to be involved in electoral politics at all. They want it to just be a local grassroots movement. And I read this book about the whole history of it. It's been that way since the 90s. Like there's this one faction that doesn't want to do with anything like that. And then there's another group that like wants to do both. It's just like, we can do both. You can actually spurn local engagement if you have national figures. And like I just call them decentralization zealots, have basically won and kind of hampered the Green Party's ability to do anything, because like in my state, for example, in New York, they don't even share their fundraising data with the National Party. Another is Cornel West actually isn't even the Green Party's official candidate because they don't hold their general election until July of 2024, like 2 months before the election. So there's actually a reasonable chance that he could not even get the nomination because but yeah, it was funny that I started listening to your podcast and then went to this meeting, which was like my first foray into like social movement and political organizing, and just saw all of these what looked to me like archetypal disagreements and problems with harm. Yeah, it's absurd.
Yeah, and so that, I mean, so that's the thing, is like, you know, on the one hand, the overarching theme of what we're getting at is the temperament that allows one to just perceive the ecological crisis on the terms it really exists and understand that the political system we inhabit won't solve it. But then really it's actually a, you know, a kind of like more acute set of temperaments than that, really, that are also willing to concretely engage with real questions about how to respond that actually matter, instead of just spinning out into nonsense and chaos. And that, you know, but I think it's like the conceptual framework is the same ultimately, in that like we know that these aren't a question of just like logical argumentation, that you can, you know, you can present the reasons that it's like not reasonable to have the conversation about reparations at the school board workshop as if the school board guy is going to be dishing out reparations checks or whatever, you know, but it's like there's a really complex set of mostly unarticulated, mostly unexamined interactions between individual biology and experiential environmental factors that generates these temperaments that are capable of doing something strategic and coherent, or just kind of not, you know. But that's another huge aspect of it, is like, how do we get people to not only see what's happening, but engage with it in a way that makes sense? And here is where I really think that other aspects of these initiatives we're working on are important. But one thing that I think is true is that people can't respond to the ecological crisis in a way that is grounded and coherent without some kind of sense of a collective endeavor to participate in that does make sense, that you really have to, that you only can elicit a certain set of temperaments and a certain set of people if you really give them something to focus on, right? And that movement politics right now are this real chaos because we really just don't talk in these terms. Like, my experience of social movements, which is very considerable, is that we just talk like it's still the Enlightenment, and we really think that you just have to present a rational argument for people to do something, and that it should just kind of work. And I'm like, let me introduce you to a little thing I like to call the internet. You know, I'm like, come on, like, we still having this conversation.
As someone, I mean, it's funny because this was never a question in my mind, being a professional poker player, of the irrationality of human beings.
Exactly.
Like it was like, I remember when I first started playing, I was learning how to play the game, and like I was doing all this research and learning all these strategies. And I was like, you know, people are eventually going to catch up to me, or like, and this game's not going to be as profitable anymore. And it hasn't changed one bit. People want to gamble. Like that's the end of the story right there. But yeah, it's interesting how, you know, it's interesting how you've talked a lot about how you want to, you're looking for a certain subset of people that have high empathy yet high strategic ability too.
Yeah.
And what you need to do for both of those things to manifest. Like for me, it's like, well, I had the strategy, I just didn't have the empathy until I started like really looking into those wounds. But like the people in social movements, it sounds like it's the opposite.
It's the
thing.
opposite.
Like they have the
Exactly.
empathy, but they don't have the strategy, and I'm not really sure where you develop that from.
Right.
Because yeah, that's not my experience. I can't like give any anecdotes towards that. I do think like my guess is in trying to parse whether like the inability to organize is based in trauma or biological differences. I think like in some cases, like the reparations guy and the swastika thing is like a clear like trauma response of like, I need to prove that this is a threat. Like that's a general trauma response to like be like so overly questioning you can't trust anyone. So you just like you have to like prove yourself right, even if that's not actual reality. But I do think there's like a biological temperament thing too of like that further complicates this question that I'm not really sure what you can do about.
Well, I think with all, I mean, I think that the way I just think of social structures, social conditions, and their relation to individual temperament is, you know, for any kind of human reaction norm to an environmental condition, there's a range, right? You know, there's some people who occupy extremes. It's like no matter how like it's, you know, it's true that the extent of fear in a society is strongly predictive of the hierarchical worldviews of that society, right? So it's like there's going to be people on the extremes who, like, no matter how fear-inducing or lacking in fear stimuli social conditions are, there's going to be some people who just have like insanely hierarchical outlooks, some people who are just really resistant to that, right? But then there's this very, you know, the central tendency, like the very large part of that normal distribution curve is going to be people who are like fairly plastic and like pretty broadly responsive to, you know, who contain within them both of those phenotypes under sufficiently, you know, extreme environmental conditions. And so our question is, you know, there's always going to be some people who just can't, who really like a given perspective is virtually impossible to elicit within them. But
That makes sense.
you know, it's like we're talking about capturing a large enough part of a distribution curve, you know.
Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to mention about this subject was like been very interested in starting eco villages over the last like 3 or 4 years, mostly as like a climate survival project, but also just because it's like I kind of want to recreate like all the things I didn't get to have in my childhood, like an actual community and like like that kind of stuff. But I remember I was doing research on this. It's really hard for communities to and I assume this goes for movements too and parties to embrace too many traumatized people. Like there's like a ratio of like 25-1 in order to support someone who's like really traumatized. Right. That I think is kind of like really important to think about when trying to assemble a group capable of doing something really drastic in regards to climate or really anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely have the same experience as you of like retrospecting. You were talking about with your crew of digital nomads, of kind of retrospecting on social configurations that have played a central role in my life. You know, these like scenes of friends embedded in these sort of broader kind of like underground art and performance worlds, where for the longest time I really thought like, oh yeah, we're defined by these particular artistic tendencies, these particular aesthetic niches. And then it was really like so late in life, spending significant time, like my social context becoming all these people through organizing who had like pretty, like reasonably comfortable lives and hadn't had anything just like appallingly, unspeakably terrible happen to them when they were little, where I really had to come to terms with this fact that no, the central kind of like social configurations that so much of my life have been based on are defined by trauma. They're just defined by the bad things that happened to all of us when we were little kids. And that was really heavy, man. I mean, like really, really, it continues to really, I think about all the people I know who've died and stuff, and it really puts it in a different light. It's because I think I'm just so aware that most of the people I know from those contexts have never had the experience necessary to gain that perspective. They like never really got to see that this isn't the world, this isn't life, this is like this much more specific thing. And I think that the relationship between strategic initiatives and trying to create like certain types of social dynamics and social configurations and people's developmental contexts is really complex, but I will at least say I'm very aware, I'm aware of the ways that it radically transformed who I was and healed me to be around mostly people who just like weren't crazy because something really awful had happened to them, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fucked. I mean, like I could have easily been one of your friends who just overdosed, or like I could have never found the right therapist and just off myself because everything was just so fucking painful. And yeah, I covered it's just like there's just a lot of luck involved. But if we want to like try and change the odds, like this is the questions that we want to explore here. Yeah.
And the thing is there's that tension where people who haven't had sufficiently transformative experiences of some kind or another are often just incapable of seeing the world as it is, right? I mean, that's the other thing that I encountered was for the first time I really met people. I mean, my friends are a mess and they can't really do much about the world, but they're not in denial about it, right? They understand, because it doesn't cost them anything. They're already in so much pain that they're, and but these other people, it's like once I became familiar with the liberal dinner table and the kind of conversations that middle class people are having, I was like, oh, you guys actually, you have something to lose. And so it's hard for you to see the world as it is. And so that's just, it's like,
it really comes down, like we're talking about just like you're coming from like a new age cult and like being around anarchists your whole life. Like I've just been around liberal deniers and libertarians most of my life, and I understand that world like way more where they're coming from. And a lot of it is just like I've got something to lose.
Totally.
But a lot of it also too is just like it's really just kind of like this self-preservation mindset of like, is it going to affect me? Like, right. Yes, no, like, and then the media does a good job of saying like, yeah, the climate change is real, but it doesn't really actually. It's the media is occupied by these same kind of people who aren't raising the alarm bells to the degree of like the destruction that we're seeing because it's controlled by this kind of weird American mindset of just like we've got money and like I'll be okay. So like even though realistically they might not be, but there's other things they can fall back upon there.
I don't think they will. And I think that this is something that some people are starting to viscerally feel, where like the way that the fires and stuff feel they're suddenly like, wait, is this just going to starve people in the global south, or is this going to affect me too, you know? But
Yeah.
that is one of the crazy ways in which the web of incoherent liberal bullshit that masquerades as leftism that came out of the academy but is now so ubiquitous in our culture actually really reinforces the complacency that we see. Is like, there is this whole realm of politics and culture where you can't talk about the climate crisis in general terms. You can't say like, hey, look, we're triggering the same feedback mechanisms that engendered past mass extinctions where there wasn't oxygen left in the atmosphere, because you have to talk about how it's going to differentially affect, you know, groups that are more or less privileged. And you have to like, you immediately have to go into like privilege discourse mode. And that makes a bunch of people feel like, oh, okay, so I am safe. You know, like what we're talking about is like how much empathy I have for people in Bangladesh, but I'm going to be okay. And it's like, no, man, you're not going to be okay.
Yeah.
But that's
The
one of the ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I see it too. The other big psychological barrier that these groups have is like techno-optimism. Because that's the system they've grown up in, that's the system they've benefited from. And most of the people I talk to, like, who are still in this kind of expired paradigm, like, will just be like, yeah, but like, they'll figure it out. Like, there's technological things you can do. And it's like, well, did you see? And these are the kind of people that get comforted by it. Like, I just saw recently the Biden administration like gave $3.5 billion to direct air capture, which would like take, it was like 1 million parts per million out of the atmosphere per year or something like that. And like, if you're at all familiar, like you're like, this is just optics. Like that's all it is. Or even more conspiratorially, like you could trace that Warren Buffett actually has like stocks in the technology. So you're like, but it looks good to this subset of people. They're like, yeah, they are doing something. Like, look, we can suck that out of the air. And yeah, that's a whole nother thing that you have to deal with when like, even when people are feeling the direct effects with the fires and floods or things, and like even if their vacation spots in Maui are burning, like that you have to get around because it's really, really ingrained in this culture.
Yeah.
So hopeless.
The last thing I wanted to make sure that we touched on with your experience specifically is just a little bit about, because you really, really, really lucked out in finding a psychotherapist on your first try who was like amazingly conducive to all of these profound transformations. I mean, that is like not necessarily the vibe. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I don't like what he is like what the paradigm is, or what the interaction is.
Hopefully we could actually bring him on this podcast, because I think we'd have a ton of it. If he's willing to go public, which I know he has before. He's been on TV talking about, like, he used to run with Ivan Illich, like was one of his really good friends.
Oh, sure.
And a couple of other philosophers around that era. But he's thought deeply about like societal problems and what we can do about them, and has a real like rigorous understanding of anarchism and politics too, that I don't think almost any therapist really does. As far as like how I reached out to him, it was just like, I remember in his bio, he said he like specialized in emotionally based physical illnesses.
Okay.
And I was like, at that point, I was like, I think that's probably where the diabetes is coming from and where all this other pain is coming from, because none of these doctors are telling me what's happening. So I do think there's something to like psychotherapists who are aware of like the mind body connection, where a lot of them are still operating on like a dual aspect of mind and body.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good research and hope that will shift, especially with like books like Body Keeps the Score and Waking the Tiger and all these other things. But just because there's good research doesn't mean there's good therapists. Because you have and like, it's again just another difficulty here is that I think, you know, he's transcended his own trauma pretty conclusively, and then after he did that, he wanted to help people who have also been through trauma. So there's a little like shamanic aspect of this. You can only heal something that you've been through. That yeah, it's really hard to quantify, or like you do enough research on, like, as it were, you're really going to be able to have someone experienced enough to deal with someone as traumatized as I was, for example. Like that's a very open question in my mind, and I don't know if there's an answer. But yeah, I know several friends who have spent years finding good therapists. Like it's quite an endeavor. Yeah.
Well, I really strongly suspect that, I mean, like you said, there's just like bizarre schismatic rendition of mind and body as separate domains is something that, you know, it goes beyond. We've plenty of evidence that this is a ridiculous paradigm, but it's more than, you know, it endures for reasons that go way beyond exposure to information. It's part of a world,
Yeah.
you know, it's an expression of a certain kind of worldview and way of being that people are attached to. But I also just really think that ultimately that very thing of whether a practitioner is capable of seeing somebody's individual pain in the broader context of the type of society they inhabit is probably one of the most fundamental questions that can be asked about. I think at a certain point, there really might be something to be said for psychotherapists being very public about making that distinction. Like, I'm not going to try to fix you so that you can participate in this society, because this society is bullshit, you know, in that there's going to be some people who would be able to use that as a way of like knowing, okay, like this is somebody I could go actually talk to and they may actually be able to help me.
Well, that's the whole problem, because the only person doing that right now is Jordan Peterson. Like
Right.
He's the one being like, oh, this is a societal problem, all these mental health illnesses, but he's just diagnosed it from a hierarchical perspective, and like it's just a complete mess. And I mean, this just really speaks to like, I've taken a couple courses on therapy, existential therapy and internal family systems, and they don't talk about the interrelation of society. It's just more like, just what happened to you and what can we do to fix you? Like you're a car, basically. Like it's so mechanic. And that, because that's not a part of the education, like then reactionaries who want to be famous will just exploit that space and look like someone who's cleaned their room, so to speak, psychologically, but are actually just still extreme. It's so, you know, it's one of the funniest things about that to me is that like Jordan Peterson eats nothing but meat. And like, I remember back when I was like looking for any kind of cure, and I actually started doing some paleo keto kind of things, and I was just like, this just makes me feel so dead inside. like I feel a little bit more calm because I'm just eating a bunch of fat, but I'm so dead. Like, I just can't even imagine like the psychological system that is like open to that, like feeling that way. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's kind of our broad mandate with this project, hypothetically someday sort of manifests in, is something that's a meaningful counterpart to exactly those kind of phenomena. Is like what people like Jordan Peterson are doing, right? Is presenting some process of like significant, a capacity for significant widespread engagement in psychological transformation that allows people to understand their pain in the context of the kind of society we inhabit, and gives them real as opposed to imaginary, explanations of why they're in that pain, and therefore catalyzes a shift in their fundamental state of being that allows them to make a different kind of society.
Yeah.
I think that's the plan.
Yeah. Let's do that. Let's do it. And yeah, we've got what, like 5 years left before things get really
Who knows? Or not, but
yeah.
we've got
Optimistically.
however much time we've got, but we might as well do something as opposed to nothing.
Okay.